This podcast is a proud member of the Paranormality Podcast Network.
Okay. Show me.
Sometimes that is better.
Welcome to the Prairie Land Paranormal Podcast.
Be sure you never, ever scream.
A podcast where we will explore the dark corners of our world, the weird, the creepy, and the strange.
There are no accidents, no coincidences.
I am your host, Eric Carrier.
The boogeyman is real.
And they mostly come at night.
My co-host is Jessica Carrier.
Come out wherever you are.
Thank you for joining us for a journey into the unknown.
Be one of us.
Let's get started with today's show. Hey guys, welcome to the show. This is the Prairie Land Paranormal Podcast, and I am your host, Eric Carrier. I am here with my wife and my co-host, Jessica Carrier. Jess, how are you today?
I am doing just fine. It is a beautiful spring day here in Illinois.
Yeah, it's been kind of a weird spring. It's not really deciding whether it wants to be hot or cold yet.
Yeah, it was snowing last week, and now it's in the 80s.
Yeah, typical Illinois weather for you there. Jess, what do we have in store for our listeners today?
Well, today we're going to be discussing spontaneous human combustion. It's the phenomenon where people just seem to go up in flames.
Yeah, I remember learning about this as a kid and just being totally enthralled by it. I even remember seeing pictures of like bodies that had been like burned down to ash with nothing more than just like legs and shoes left. Probably not the most healthy thing for me to be seeing as a child. But I remember being scared that at like any time it was possible that I could just randomly burst into flames. In fact, after prepping for this show, that fear may have been rekindled just a little bit.
It is a scary thought, isn't it? I don't remember even knowing about this as a child. But coming through and doing some research on it, it is kind of terrifying to think about.
No doubt. If you are a new listener and you are here for the first time, welcome. If you have been around for a while, welcome back. We know that there are a lot of podcasts out there that are competing for your time, and we are grateful that you are giving that time to us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. We are humbled by your support and that you include us in your lives.
Jessica, how can listeners support our podcast?
If you'd like to support our podcast, there are a few ways that you can do that. First, you can continue to share the show.
This is by far the most important thing that you can do to help us grow the show.
Yes. Share it with your friends, share it with your family, share it with your cubicle buddy at work.
Indie shows like ours only survive by word of mouth.
Second, you can continue to vote for us on the Paranormality Podcast Network Paranormal Top 25.
Please keep voting for us each and every month at paranormalityradio.com. This is amazing and free publicity for the show.
Third, if you would like to support the show financially, you can support our merch store, which will be coming soon.
You may have noticed that we didn't mention the tip jar. That's because we've decided to do something different with this. Starting this week, any money donated to the tip jar will be donated to charity. The charity that we have decided to support is Operation Underground Railroad.
This organization rescues children around the world from sex trafficking and from sexual exploitation.
We hope that you will join us in supporting this organization, and to show our support, we will be matching the total donations for the month up to $50.
The last way you can support our show and us is to come and hang out with us on social media. We have accounts on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, and we'd love to hang out and meet you guys there.
All of those accounts can be accessed through our website at www.prairielandparanormalpodcast.com. Okay, we have something new and exciting to tell you guys about. We have decided that it is time to start releasing some bonus material. While the details of this new adventure is still a little bit fuzzy, the general idea is that we will be releasing a short, dramatic, and terrifying story on our off weeks. This means you can expect one of these stories every other Tuesday, starting next week.
Many podcasts move their bonus material to platforms like Patreon, where you have to pay for it. We like you guys, so we're releasing this material for free.
All of our material is free.
Exactly.
So look for our first Terabyte. Is that what we're calling it, Jess? Terabyte?
Yes, TERRORBYTE.
I think that's a clever name. Yeah, so look for our first Terabyte to be dropped on next Tuesday. Anything else, Jess?
Nope, we're good.
All right, let's get started with today's show. There are some pretty bizarre things in this world. Some of these things defy explanation, such as spontaneous human combustion. Spontaneous human combustion is a phenomenon where a person seems to burst into flames without being ignited by an external source. Is this a real anomaly? Is it possible for a human body to spontaneously burst into flames? Fortunately, history has placed over 200 cases at our feet to explore, cases that go back as far as the 1600s. In fact, in the 1800s, the phenomenon was so popular, Charles Dickens used it to kill off one of his characters in the novel Bleak House, leaving the victim completely burned up and looking like a small charred and broken log of wood. Let's take a look at some of these cases and explore the phenomenon of spontaneous human combustion.
In 1663, the Dutch anatomist Thomas Bartolon is credited for the first recording of this strange phenomenon. He wrote about a woman in Paris who went up in ashes and smoke while sleeping. He observed that the straw mattress on which the woman was sleeping was unmarred by the fire.
In 1951, 61-year-old Mary Reeser became a victim of spontaneous human combustion. Mary lived alone. On the day that Mary died, her landlady knocked on her door to deliver a telegram. When there was no answer, she tried the door. The doorknob was hot, so she called the police.
When the police arrived, they discovered that whatever fire had occurred was already out. They found Mary's remains on a chair. Her body had mostly been reduced to ash. All that remained was her slippered foot, her spine, and her skull. The skull was one of the most unusual aspects of the case. According to investigators, it had shrunk to the size of a teacup.
One strange thing investigators noticed about the scene was that there was very little damage done to the room. There were a few plastic objects that had melted just enough to morph their shape, but nothing else was damaged. They didn't even find much smoke damage in the room. The fire investigation found that the temperatures had to have reached at least 1600 degrees Fahrenheit to do the damage that had been done to her body.
At the inquest, an FBI investigator speculated that since she was known for taking sleeping pills, she may have fallen asleep while smoking. This was quickly refuted by other investigators who claimed that the fire from the cigarette could not have caused the extreme temperatures that cremated her body.
In 1966, Irving John Bentley, a 92-year-old retired scientist, became another victim of spontaneous human combustion. His body was discovered on the morning of December 5th when a meter reader entered Irving's home to check the meter. Due to Irving's advanced age, the meter reader was given permission to enter unannounced as needed. As he went to the basement, he noted a blue smoke that he described as sweet smelling. It was then that he noted a small pile of ash on the floor. There were no burn marks on the floor, just a pile of ash. There was, however, a large hole in the ceiling above. Seeing this, he decided to investigate.
The upstairs bedroom was full of smoke, and he found the remains of Irving in the bathroom. All that was left was a pile of ash and the lower half of the scientist's right leg. The foot was still wearing a slipper. Panicked, he quickly called for help.
There were numerous theories about the scientist's strange death. Some speculated that Irving had accidentally set himself on fire with his pipe. However, the pipe was found unlit by his bedside table. Others, noting that his clothing was found smoldering in the bathtub, concluded that his clothes must have caught fire from matches in his pocket. Maybe Irvin had awoken to find his clothes on fire and ran to the bathroom to remove his clothes, but died before he could extinguish the fire. This theory seems false, in that the matches in his pocket were unlit, and a fire hot enough to fully cremate a body was unlikely to have been started by an unlit match.
In 1967, Robert Francis Bailey became another victim of spontaneous human combustion. Robert was alone in an abandoned building when his body caught fire. He was a well-known alcoholic, and it was believed that he was seeking shelter from the cold on the night when he entered the abandoned building. A person walking by called the fire department when he saw a bright light coming from the inside of the building.
The fire crew made good time and were at the abandoned building within 5 minutes of the call. They found Robert on the floor, curled up in the fetal position. He had a 4-inch slit in his stomach from which flames were coming out. The fire crew said that the flames came out like a blowtorch.
Robert was still alive when the crew arrived, writhing in pain and biting the stair post. The fire crew emptied several fire extinguishers before the flames died out. Robert succumbed to this ordeal, and the fire crew had to pry his jaw open around the post to remove his body from the scene.
As typical with spontaneous human combustion, there were several odd aspects to the scene. Nothing else in the room other than Robert's body was on fire, and there was little fire damage to the room, despite there being several highly flammable substances on the premises. Even Robert's clothing was odd, as the parts that were charred only included the shirt covering his stomach and a bit of the floor below his body.
At the inquest, a hypothesis was formed that the fire could have possibly been caused by Robert dropping a cigarette onto his shirt that was soaked in alcohol. However, the lack of surrounding damage and the speed and ferocity of the flames made the theory unlikely. Also noted was the fact that the fire caused by a dropped cigarette would not have been bright enough to have attracted the attention of a passerby.
In 1982, 61-year-old Jeannie Saffin also perished from spontaneous human combustion. Jeannie's case is one of the most frequently discussed cases because, unlike most victims, Jeannie was not alone. Several people witnessed what happened to her.
Jeannie was born with significant physical disabilities, so even as an adult, she still lived with her parents. On September 15, 1982, she was in the kitchen with her father and brother-in-law. Things were normal, and both men were absorbed in other things until a bright light caught their attention. As they turned, they were horrified to see that Jeannie was on fire.
Both men immediately began dousing her with water in an effort to put out the flames. They then called an ambulance. Jeannie was treated for severe burns in the hospital for 8 days before she died from her injuries. Her actual cause of death is listed as bronchopneumonia secondary to burns.
At the inquest, investigators struggled to figure out how Jeannie had caught fire, and they tried the best they could to piece together the circumstances. Jeannie's family insisted that her death was a case of spontaneous human combustion. Jeannie's father said that he witnessed flames shooting out of her mouth that made a terrifying roaring noise and looked like a dragon breathing fire. Her father also claimed that the clothing Jeannie had been wearing was completely untouched by the fire.
The coroner was skeptical and rebuffed the family's claims, insisting that humans cannot spontaneously catch fire. Researchers later came up with a theory that maybe the fire was caused by the pilot light on the family's kitchen stove. They suggested that windows left open in the kitchen could have caused a cross breeze that pulled the flame towards Jeannie, setting her on fire.
On March 26, 1986, George Mott died in a mysterious fire. George was a retired fireman who suffered from lung disease that required him to use an oxygen tank. George's son Kendall became worried the morning of the 26th when his father hadn't answered repeated phone calls.
Due to George's health problems, he was home most of the time, and Kendall would check in on him. After not being able to summon his father by phone, Kendall decided to personally go to his father's house and check in on him. When he arrived, he noticed that all of the house's windows had a strange brown color to them, and after opening the door, the air on the inside of the house was smoky and smelt burnt. George, a former smoker, had quit due to his lung disease, so the smell was unexpected.
When Kendall finally found his father, or what remained of him, he quickly called the authorities. All that remained of George Mott was a pile of ashes and a few pieces of bone. Authorities noted that the damage was similar to what would happen to a body that had been professionally cremated.
As strange as the death seemed, what was more perplexing were the inconsistencies in the room. A nearby television had melted, yet the bedding where George's body was burned remained largely untouched. There was a book of matches on the bedside table, but they hadn't ignited. Investigators also noted that George's oxygen tank and face mask were undamaged and the tank was still running.
How could this have happened? The official theory was that George had decided to light a cigarette. He may have then removed his mask, leaving it untouched. While this theory possibly explains a fire, it doesn't explain how a fire hot enough to cremate a body incinerated him, yet left his bedding undamaged.
As terrible as the thought of dying in a spontaneous fire would be, what if you spontaneously combusted and lived? This has happened. Cases are rare, but there are a few recorded instances where the victims lived for at least a short period of time.
In 1776, an Italian friar by the name of Don Dio Maria Bartoli seems to have somehow spontaneously combusted. In October, he was in a small town of Fileto, conducting some town business. He had retired for the evening and was staying at his brother-in-law's house. Not long after going to bed, the other household members were alarmed to hear Bartoli screaming as if in great pain.
Rushing to his aid, they found the friar surrounded by what they described as an aura of blue flame. The flame behaved strangely. As the relatives approached the flame, they said it looked like the flames actually cringed away from them, as if the flames were aware of them, before dissipating completely. Bartoli was left moaning and in agony. One report of the incident reads,
Perceiving the cries of the priest, they repaired instantly to the apartment, and on entering it, found him extended on the paved floor, and enveloped in a thin flame which receded as they approached him, and at length entirely vanished. They placed him, as soon as possible, upon his bed and administered to him every kind of aid that was at hand. Although the friar had survived the incident, he was suffering serious burns, and when he was able to articulate what had happened, he explained that it felt as if an unseen hand had struck him, after which he had erupted in flames. Oddly, it was found that although his body was burned and his silk cap had been burned to a crisp, his shirt and trousers were undamaged, and his hair had remained unscathed too, despite burns on his face. Making it stranger still was that although there had been quite a bit of fire, the room had no smoke or odor of the fire, and nothing in the vicinity had been damaged.
The physician who came to examine Bartoli found him in a very rough state. The French physician François-Emmanuel Faudier described the incident with much detail. On the following morning, the patient was examined by M. Batalja, who found the integuments of the right arm almost entirely detached and pendant from the flesh. From the shoulders to the thighs, the integuments were equally injured, and on the right hand, the part most injured, mortification had already commenced, which, notwithstanding immediate scarification, rapidly extended itself. The patient complained of burning thirst and was horribly convulsed. He passed by stool putrid and bilious matter. and was exhausted by continual vomiting accompanied by fever and delirium. On the 4th day, after 2 hours of comatose insensibility, he expired. During the whole period of his suffering, it was impossible to trace any symptomatic affection. A short time previous to his decease, M. Batalja observed with astonishment that putrefaction had made so much progress that the body already exhaled an insufferable odor, worms crawled from it on the bed, and the nails had become detached from the left hand.
What happened to Bartoli? In the end, no one was able to ascertain exactly what happened. There was no explanation offered, and it just remains a very bizarre phenomenon and historical oddity.
In 1822, on a summer day in the countryside of France, a local resident named Ranatou had an unforgettable experience. He allegedly felt a sharp and sudden pain in his right index finger, and as he casually glanced at it, trying to figure out where the pain was coming from, he realized with terror that his finger was actually on fire. Upon waving his finger, his whole hand ignited.
In a panic, Ranatou wildly batted his hand on his pants, trying to put out the fire, only to end up setting them on fire. As he clapped his hands together, his left hand ignited as well. At this point, Ranatou ran to his house, screaming for his wife to bring him a bucket of cold water.
Plunging his hands into the water failed to douse the flames. He continued to try to douse the flames by shoving his hands in wet mud and even milk, but nothing would stop them. By this time, a crowd of curious onlookers came to see what had happened. One of the spectators brought him some holy water, which finally killed the flames.
Oddly enough, Ranatou's clothes, where he had touched them, were burned, but his hands remained intact, suffering only minor burns considering how long they had been on fire. This case appeared in an 1822 French medical journal and has been labeled as unsolved.
Over the years, more than 200 persons have burned to ashes with no apparent cause. While rare, cases of spontaneous human combustion are still reported today, and news articles from all over the world still occasionally report incidents. While the phenomenon continues to be a mystery, scientists, doctors, and authors alike have theorized how spontaneous human combustion can occur. Stick around after the break, and we will discuss some of the most common theories of how human beings can spontaneously burst into flames.
Hello, friends. Jimmy Horrors here from the Night's End podcast. Do you want a delicious story to keep you up at night? Well then, make sure you take the right door on your way down, as the others could lead to your immediate death. Just search the Night's End podcast on all major podcast platforms and be sure to bring a sacrifice for my things. Trust me, you don't want to see them cranky.
All right, Jess, so that was our research into spontaneous human combustion. And I gotta tell you, I'm still terrified. It seems very random, but it's also very scary.
It is scary. I mean, there's lots of ways you wouldn't want to die, but burning has got to be one of on the top of the list there.
Yes, I would not even say got to be. Burning is absolutely at the top of that list. It's at least at the very top of my list. Are you writing that down? Why are you writing that down?
It's important for a wife to know these things.
That her husband is terrified of burning to death?
All important things to keep tabs of.
Don't worry, I'm keeping tabs too. So yes, I am terrified of burning to death, as I think probably most of you are. And I suspect that if I were to check your guys' list, it would also probably be at the top. So as we look at these cases, there are some similarities and there are some characteristics that seem to be very common to almost all of them. So Jess, what did you notice that was something similar between all of these cases?
Well, in most of the cases, the bodies were almost all the way consumed or burned up, but maybe like just a few parts were left behind, like some bones or ash or something.
Yes, that is a very common type of characteristic that is seen in a lot of these different cases. One thing that I noticed was that these cases all seem to mostly take place in their own homes, and in almost every case, they are almost always alone.
So there are very few witnesses, making it hard to determine what happened.
Yes, which is why I think most of these cases are labeled mysterious, because no one knows for certain exactly what happened.
Which is why there's a whole bunch of theories, but there are very few cases where someone can actually say, oh, I saw this happening.
Yeah, and the cases that we reported of that were also extremely odd, very, very weird types of fire and experiences.
Yeah, it wasn't like, oh, well, this person, started to combust because of this. They just were guessing.
So another thing that I noticed that was kind of similar between these cases is a lot of these people were reported to be smokers.
Yeah, I noticed that.
And a couple of them were even on oxygen.
Now, would the smoking part could have possibly been a reason for the person who died in the 1600s? I don't know. Did they smoke back then?
Well, I can't say for certain that that person was a smoker, but I can tell you that he lived in a time period where you would have to light a room with a match or a candle.
That is true.
So most of these cases all have a clear flammable substance and a clear mechanism or fire starter. And what I mean by that is that if you look at these cases individually, you see that we've got smokers, we've got former smokers, we've got alcoholics, we've got matches, we've got pipe smokers, we've got stoves and or potential for candles or other type of fire devices. So in a lot of these cases, it's possible that a flame was involved in some way, that these people did not just mysteriously go up in flames.
I guess that's possible. It's just hard because no one sees it. No one knows what happened for sure.
That is correct. But they all had mitigating factors that could have been contributory. The other thing that we have to consider as far as a similarity is the condition and or the state of the body after this has occurred.
Yes, we already talked about how most of the body was burned up, but it's interesting that the certain parts of the body are left unburned, like the extremities, maybe a foot or a hand or something.
Yeah, that is interesting, and that is a clear similarity that most of these cases involved a torso being completely burned up, but at least some assemblage of a extremity remaining. The state of the rooms is also very similar. The majority of the rooms in these cases do not suggest that a serious fire took place.
And that is so strange. And I think that's what kind of gets a lot of people and, researchers, what happened where something can be so hot that it literally burns up a person, but doesn't affect the room, the surrounding room.
Yeah, it's very, very odd. But it is one of the classic hallmarks of a case of spontaneous human combustion. So let's also take a look at some of the common theories that people have put out to suggest how this phenomenon is potentially possible.
Like any strange phenomenon, people try to study it and understand what happened so that they can figure out ways to maybe keep it from happening.
Yes, many of these theories are backed by science, and many of them have been tested on body farms to find out if there is any actual validity to them. So what are some of the theories, Jessica?
One of the theories is that these things happen naturally through natural causes. We've kind of talked a little bit about that when we talked about cigarettes. Many people who are reported to naturally combust have a connection to cigarettes and matches. The theory is, if someone were immobile for some reason, like they had a heart attack or a stroke and they've fallen and hit their head and are left unconscious with a burning object nearby, such as a cigarette or a match, that under the right conditions, a body could be consumed by even a small fire.
While we know that a cigarette or a match could absolutely start a fire, it seems odd that it would start a fire of this magnitude in this type of situation. Because to completely cremate someone's body, the temperature has to get up to at least 1600 degrees. And in these situations, it doesn't seem like there's enough fuel for that to happen, given the state of the room these people have been discovered in. Another popular theory is alcoholism. This theory was popularized by Charles Dickens, particularly after he killed off one of his characters in the book Bleak House. There really are two separate theories behind this. One is that alcohol is flammable, and the other is that alcoholism can lead to certain conditions that could put a person in a high flammability state. One of those conditions is known as ketosis, which can occur with alcoholism. It can also occur with diabetes and or low-carb diets. This condition puts a lot of acetone into our blood, which is a highly flammable material.
Another theory presented was given by Dr. Lawrence Afrin, who suggested that this could be caused by mast cell activation.
Without getting overly technical, because this is very technical, one of the places that these mast cells are stored is in our fat stores. Under the right circumstances, Dr. Afrin proposes that a flood of mediators released from the mast cells could activate a switch that could cause excess heat to build up in our bodies. He believed that this could reach temperatures of up to 194 degrees Fahrenheit.
There is even a case report of a man with MCAS who grew ill and his body appeared to actually be smoking in front of witnesses.
Another theory was proposed by a British chemist by the name of John Emsley, and he suggested that this might be caused from what's called pyrophoric liquid buildup. According to this theory, a pyrophoric liquid, possibly diphosphane, which occurs in the gut, could self-combust, igniting hydrogen and methane gases that occur naturally in the gut. He believes this is why witnesses claim to see blue flames originating from the victims' abdomens. Basically, this theory hypothesizes what we already all know, that farts are flammable. So the next theory, Jess, is lightning. So what does that mean exactly? Does it mean Zeus is angry and he's like striking these people down?
I think it's more of the idea of something like ball lightning. Chemical engineer John Abramson basically said that the charring of human limbs seen in a number of ball lightning cases are very similar to spontaneous human combustion.
Yeah, that's because ball lightning tends to happen from the middle out, leaving limbs relatively untouched and or unconsumed, which is very similar to what we see in spontaneous human combustion. The interesting thing about ball lightning too is that it's been known to actually like come through windows and other things like that, which could potentially explain cases like genies. Another theory was put forth by electrical engineer and author Larry E. Arnold. He presented this theory in his book, which came out in 1995, which is called Ablaze. Jessica, what was this theory?
Basically, this theory evolved around a theoretical substance that he proposed existed called Pyrotron.
Ooh, that sounds like a Transformer. Was this a Autobot or a Decepticon?
I don't know, Pyrotron. It seems like it'd be more a Decepticon. It kind of seems evil and powerful.
I agree.
Basically, Arnold wrote that the flammability of the human body could increase through things like alcohol or stress, and that you would cause this combustion that was an oxidation reduction reaction. So you wouldn't really need oxygen to combust.
Yeah, and back in 1995, this theory was extremely popular, but it's since been criticized as being based on only selective evidence. Author Michael Harrison had an interesting idea. What was his idea?
His idea was that spontaneous human combustion is connected with paranormal activity, in particular poltergeist activity.
So he thinks that poltergeists are burning these people up?
Well, basically, he's saying that the force which activates poltergeist originates in and is supplied by a human being. So basically, the energy from the human being being manipulated by poltergeist would cause the human to combust, I guess.
Ooh, that sounds like Firestarter. Yeah, Harrison's book came out in 1976. It was called Fire from Heaven. And Firestarter, which came out by Stephen King, came out in 1980. So it's possible that Stephen King was inspired by this when he wrote that book.
Who knows? Authors are often inspired through science.
Or in this case, probably science fiction. So this next theory, which is by far the most popular, is called the Wick theory. And this one has been scientifically tested at body farms, and it is found to be not only accurate, but repeatable. So this theory requires a small external flame source, something even as small as a cigarette or a match. In this theory, that small external flame source starts by charring the clothing of the victim, but only to the point where it splits the skin, which then releases subcutaneous fat that is then absorbed into the burned clothing, acting as a wick, which potentiates the fire all the way through the point until the fuel is consumed. So as long as there's body fat available, this fire can continue for as long as it needs to.
Which kind of explains why some of the extremities aren't burned, because they don't really have as much fat, I guess, as the main body does.
At least in America. We all tend to be a little tubby over here. So it turns out, tubby or not, the human body, even in those who are thin, tend to have several pounds of body fat that could move this reaction along, essentially turning a person into a candle. This makes complete sense because candles were originally made from animal fats. This would also be a low flame reaction, which could account for why the rooms in these situations aren't completely burnt down. It kind of also makes sense because the further out you come on extremities, the more meat or muscle you're getting. So you're having less fat as the reaction occurs distally. So you have limbs that are not consumed.
Yes, that makes sense. But what about water? Our body is full of water. How could you account for that?
Well, the theory is that if this combustion were slow and lasted hours instead of minutes, the water would evaporate slowly over time, leaving just fat.
So in this situation, we're not exactly having a giant spontaneous combustion, but more of a slow burn.
Yes, a slow burn over time, taking several hours. So after seeing research that was done on body farms using not only bodies, but also pigs, I think that this is the most likely reason that spontaneous human combustion occurs.
I still think it's poltergeist.
You would. All I'll say is that the poltergeist activity theory is not backed by science. I don't know, folks. What do you think? Spontaneous human combustion, is it real? Is it caused by Wick theory? Is it caused by poltergeists? Is it caused because Zeus is angry and striking these people down with a thunderbolt?
Or is it dragons?
At no time in this discussion, Jessica, did we ever discuss dragons.
We could have.
Well, one thing is for sure. Spontaneous human combustion is a terrifying reality. Regardless of the many theories that have been presented, one thing is certain. The cause of spontaneous human combustion is still unknown, and the phenomenon as a whole remains very much a mystery. All right, folks, that is going to do it for us. We will see you next time.
Thanks for joining us.
All right, folks, that's the end of this episode. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate you listening. If you have enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing through your favorite podcast player. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And remember that if you've had a paranormal experience that you would like to share, you can email us at prairielandparanormalpodcast@gmail.com, Or you can submit that experience through our website at www.prairielandparanormalpodcast.com. So, until next time, remember, don't be normal when you can be paranormal.